Do what thou wilt should be the whole of the law. This is the third class of the seminar on Little Essays Towards Truth by Aleister Crowley. We're covering chapter 4 and chapter 5, which are on the visions of wonder and the trance of beatitude. So let's just go right into our text. Oops. Oops. Hang on. I'm going to share screen. Or we are, if I can get the text to come up. Just a moment.
Sure.
Okay, here we go. Okay, take 2 on sharing the screen. There we go. Here we go, Trance of Wonder. Stephen, if you could read, start us out here.
Sure. A little more than kin and a little less than kind are the trance of sorrow and the vision of the machinery of the universe.
Of course,
This latter
this is a quotation from Hamlet. And so Hamlet, of course, starts out the play depressed, and that's the vision of sorrow. But Hamlet is also the person who has the line, "What a work of wonder is man." I'm slightly misquoting that. And so these two, which is the vision of wonder. So these two things are going to go together. Keep going.
Gotcha. Are the trance of sorrow and the vision of the machinery of the universe. This latter being the technical aspect of the apprehension of the law of change, which is also a trance of the same order of that of sorrow. Now, one mode of victory over all these is the trance of indifference, in which one stands aloof from the matter, but only one mode, and in generally known form, full of falsehood and imperfection. For to stand aloof is to affirm duality, which itself is the root of sorrow. To obtain the highest, one must unite oneself with all things, partake of all as the true sacrament, and this motion leads to the trance of wonder.
Okay, so we're talking about the transmutation of the trance of sorrow into the trance of wonder. So let's review just a little bit. First of all, what we mean by trance or vision in this text is I'm reading this as equivalent to what in phenomenology is called a state of being or state of mind. This is what Martin Heidegger in Being and Time refers to as, by the German word, Befindlichkeit. What this means is it's more than just a passing mood or emotion that we have. So the idea here, of course, is that our cognitive experience that we have, our experience of the phenomenological life world, the world of our experience, is determined and affected by a kind of hermeneutical or interpretive pre-having or prehension that we have. So we have a particular orientation that isn't neutral, and that orientation determines, as it were, how we are experiencing the world. It's a kind of precognitive orientation. And so in magical practice, spirituality, as well as in everyday life, we often have a kind of predisposition or pre-orientation, and this determines how the world shows up or appears for us. And so what Crowley is doing is studying various types of these states of being that one would have that spontaneously arise or are invoked in magical practice. And then what's the meaning that these have for our magical practice? And the idea here is that the analysis of these states of being for Heidegger and in phenomenology opens the door to what Heidegger calls the existential analytic, which is a kind of peeling back of the primordial layers of being of human existence, which of course Heidegger calls Dasein, meaning a kind of being there or a mere existent. And the idea here is that through this kind of analysis, you can uncover the primordial structure of human existence, not just on the level of like a biological or even a superficially psychological examination, but to understand human existence at the level of being with a capital B. And what this means is that, as we've been discussing, the way that we're oriented interpretively towards the world in such a way that the world is able to be illuminated or light up or appear for us as a phenomenon requires that there's already in place what in philosophy is called the transcendental horizon. And what this means is that there's our cognitive apparatus is already structured in such a way that we're able to encounter the world in a certain way. So the way Heidegger talks about this is he says, when you see a tree, you have to already know that what a tree is to be able to recognize that the tree is a tree. And that recognition doesn't occur just in our immediate cognition. It's a kind of deeper structure of our being in terms of which we're oriented to the world, such that we already have this semantical, semiotic kind of structuring of our experience. That we don't, in fact, it works all the more smoothly the more unconscious that this is. So when we first learn a language, it's very clumsy and we have to like think about how we're understanding things. But as we become more skillful in our coping with the world in terms of the linguistic categories that we're socialized into as human beings, that process becomes smoother and smoother until it becomes unconscious and automatic. And that structuring within the psyche that facilitates that transcendental horizon in terms of which we're able to understand the world. This is what the psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan calls the imaginary with a capital I. And so it's in terms of this structuring that we can have something like a world and that we can experience ourselves as something like a subject that is within a world. And so it's a kind of what Crowley calls a spiritual principle, but by this, he doesn't mean something in another world. He means something that's an aspect of our own existential being that is in virtue of which we're able to have experience at all in the first place. So on the tree of life, these principles would be located at the level of the supernals. So he talks about the visions of, in this first paragraph, there's the vision of sorrow, there's the vision of change, and the vision of indifference or individuality. And these are associated with Binah for sorrow, Hokmah for change, and Kether for indifference. And so, but Crowley's point is that the supernals all act together. So these have to be like synthesized with each other to be operating properly. If you're overemphasizing one over the other, then you'll become unbalanced. And as the initiate is taught in the Golden Dawn, equilibrium is the basis of the great work. We'll have more to say about that, of course, as we go on, and also these other. So anyway, the trance of sorrow is alchemically transmuted into the trance of wonder. But how is that going to occur? Okay, so talked about, let's move on to the second. Have we talked about the trance of yes, the machinery of the universe? You notice here in that first sentence, it talks about the vision of the machinery of the universe. Okay, which is an aspect of the law of change. So what Crowley is here alluding to is in the Bhagavad Gita, there's one point in that where the Arjuna has a vision of Krishna as the all-devourer. And so there's a vision of the divine as this like all-devouring furnace that everything in the universe is kind of being eaten up by. And this is in a way, the vision of the machinery of the universe. It's a vision of fatality, of the idea that we're all, as the Buddha says, all compound aggregates are subject to decay. So there's a kind of inherent negativity to all being, in terms of which change is possible. Because if there was not this inherent negativity, then being would be a simple unity that would have no differentiation, and therefore it wouldn't change over time. But if that were the case, we wouldn't be able to have experience. Because you couldn't then have life, because life has to appear and then disappear and then regenerate itself as a kind of cyclical process. And so deprived of that, everything would just be a bare, simple state, and nothing would be happening. And the problem with that is that then we wouldn't be able to have the adventure of our true wills. And so we need to have change and therefore impermanence in order to have joy and wonder and ecstasy at the same time. So these things actually go together. So the ideal here is that you begin with the trance of the, or vision of the machinery of the universe, the inexorability of all things, and you discover, as the Buddha does in the First Noble Truth, that everything is suffering. But then you discover that actually it's all a matter of perspective, because if our absolute is what Crowley is calling the Kabbalistic zero, what the Buddhists call shunyata, or nothingness, the fact that there is no ultimately abiding being, but only change and transformation, and then that means that as Nietzsche says, God is dead. There is no absolute perspective on the life world, which means that the life world is what we make of it through will to power. And so that means that pessimism towards existence has no ultimate warrant, any more than any other position. So to put it that way, we might as well be joyous about it. So in other words, we can flip this coin however we like on either side, because we're the divine beings who interpret ultimately our experience, and there's no other. We're the bottom line. We get to ultimately say what the meaning of our existence is, because we're the ones who are existing. And so again, that means that sorrow or can't be the ultimate position, because there's always diverse ways to interpret our experience. So we might as well interpret it as wonder instead of sorrow. So let's continue with the second paragraph. Henry, if you could pick up where it says, "It is written."
It is written, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Here, the predicate refers to the opening of the grade of magus, but the subject, duly translated, reads the wondering at tetragrammaton, and so refers to this trance. For herein one is wholly identified with the universe in its dynamic aspect, and the first synthesis of the understanding thereof is this amazement at the fitness and the necessity of the entire mechanism. For, given the formula of manifestation, the need to conceive and perceive perfection by means of the symbolism of imperfection, the actual process of ideation becomes apodictic.
Apodictic. I'll explain that in a minute.
Apodictic. Thank you. Apodictic. I write as for the least instructed of the little children of the light.
That's a kind of joke. Crowley knows that he's being verbose here. Actually, apodictic just means a priori, that you know something with certainty. It's a technical term in philosophy. So what's going on here? Okay, so if through will to power, we have the ability to interpret our experience ourselves, then, as Nietzsche would argue, why not choose to be what he calls to be strong for life? And part of what prevents us from doing that and reinforces nihilism is that we have this sense of being a separate abiding self apart from reality. And the alternative is the mystical and magical potential that we can undermine this sense of separation and instead identify with what Crowley calls the true will as a dynamic sense of participation with the world that comes from our deepest and most authentic totality of ourself. And when I say the totality of ourselves, I don't just mean what Freud calls the ego, the sense of self-consciousness, but the self with a capital S, as Jung calls it, which is the self in its totality, meaning the unconscious that has been integrated with the sense of ego personality. And through that integration, then the revealing of what in Kabbalah is called neshama, which is the wholeness of the self. And this wholeness has a particular drive to it, a particular purpose, is the postulate in Thelemic philosophy. And we're going to get to in a few minutes the way that Freud's theory of the drive aligns with this, but I'm anticipating here. I'll explain this all in a few minutes. And so, yeah, the point here is that if we're looking from the point of view of the totality of ourselves as a totality, not just a limited point of view of our subjective immediacy, then this means that the negativity that's inherent to reality is only a moment of the larger creative process of the prodigal fecundity of being. And this is what Crowley is referring to when he talks about the universe in its dynamic aspect. And he talks about how this is what he calls the wondering of tetragrammaton. And this is a quotation from some part of the Bible, doesn't really matter where. The point here is that the formula of tetragrammaton, magically, Yod He Vav He, is the formula of the utterance of the creative word to create the magical universe. And it's important that this is contextualized as the utterance of the magical word with a capital W. This is the concept of the logos in Greek philosophy. The idea that the reality is ordered and coherent in a certain way. It's not just random and chaotic. And in Greek philosophy, this is described by the word logos, which means word, but also just meaningfulness. But this kind of primal connection in philosophy between language and meaning is actually not superficial. It's actually very important. And the reason for that is because of what we were just talking about a moment ago, which is this idea, this discovery in modern philosophy of what's called the transcendental horizon, and that the transcendental horizon has a semiotic structure. So rather than just simply being a metaphor that the meaningfulness of the world is like the meaningfulness of language, in fact, there's a much more, Heidegger is arguing, there's a much more primordial connection between human beings as being language users and the way that we order and construct the experience of a life world around us. These two things are in fact the same process. And so to talk about the formula of tetragrammaton then as the utterance of creative word is to refer to the semiotic structure of the transcendental horizon in terms of what Lacan calls the imaginary with a capital I. And this structuring is basically the most primordial structuring of the psyche. And so it has an alignment, therefore, with neshama, with the kind of most basic structure of what in Greek philosophy is called the soul, which is a term that lacks philosophical precision, but we can still use it. And through our labors, we can give it a little bit more coherence than it maybe has in more dualistic modes of philosophy. Because remember, we're not talking about anything, when Crowley is talking about magical principles or spiritual principles like the logos or the creative word with a capital W, or all these things. He's not talking about something that's going on in another different higher world. He's talking about something that's occurring through the mediation of our own being with a capital B, of the way that human beings exist spiritually. But this is all philosophically obscure, and so we have to use phenomenology to try to unpack it and make it more clear. Precisely, if we don't have a dualistic meaning for this, what meaning do we, in fact, then have for it? And so, as we're continuing in this class, I'm laying out the puzzle pieces, as it were, to be able to then assemble a coherent philosophical model that isn't dualistic in an Osirian, metaphysical, this world and otherworldly, supernatural, where you're explaining things through supernaturalism, and in the process kind of degrading the material world as inferior to some other world that you're aspiring to. The whole point of the quest for the true will in Thelema is that what we're looking for is intraworldly. It's an expression of authentic existence that's a kind of being in the world. And so the bottom line of this is that we're trying to fulfill our ultimate potential for being within the world, within our life, within our field of experience. But to do that, we have to fulfill the Socratic maxim of know thyself. The more we know who we are and what the nature and powers of our own being are, the more we're going to be able to understand what our authentic meaning and purpose are. In other words, that we can know through magic who we are and what we're doing. And this is what is deprived from us in the alienated conditions of the everydayness of the life world, where in the vulgar world of commodity and media culture, it's just this kind of chaotic mess of all this, messaging trying to sell us products or whatever, and it lacks a kind of unity. And so, what we want to do as in our magical practice is orient ourselves towards the world in such a way that we can be the ground of our own identity and therefore our own meaning and purpose. And we don't need to have that paternalistically given to us through obeying some outside authority that would be inauthentic. Immanuel Kant talks about human freedom in terms of autonomy. What he means is that human beings should be self-legislating, that we shouldn't just be arbitrarily obeying external authority, but that we have the moral law within us. And this is in alignment with the thread of modern philosophy that leads into Thelema, which is the idea that of do what thou wilt should be the whole of the law, as we have to own and take responsibility for the fact that the magical universe that we find ourselves in, that we're the ones who are creating that. And so we have to be the ones to take responsibility for that. And when we renege on that responsibility and we find some authoritarian external authority that we invest our belief in, that's an inauthentic mode. That's the Osirian, we're back to the slave gods telling us what to do. And so we've got to break with the Christian colonial paradigm that tells us that it is expressed in modernity as totalitarianism or fascism or Christian nationalism, or take your pick of any number of political manifestations of that, or personal manifestations in the patriarchal role of the father to force other people to obey them, or however that manifests in the family or in our interpersonal relationships, where we might be either inauthentically succumb to that authority or inauthentically attempt to assume that authority over others. Because part of the whole point of this is that if we're the gods that we're looking for, we have to cooperate together. And if we don't, then things are going to be a mess. And this is like in the Trojan War in Homer, in the Iliad. It starts out where there's this war between the Greeks and the Trojans, the Hellenes and the Trojans. But then in the next chapter, you then move up to Olympus in heaven. And it turns out that the gods have taken different sides and they're all fighting with each other. And the point is that the universe has fallen into the chaos because the gods are fighting. But this is a mirror of the fact that human beings are really the agents here that are the ones who are fighting. And that's the reason that this, mythological projection of gods that exist in a higher realm, that's really a projection of what human beings are about and are doing. And so there's war in heaven because there's war on earth and vice versa. Anyway, I want to get back to our text. So the point here is that in order to identify with the creative word, to reach this phase, we have to do what Hegel calls tarrying with the negative. In other words, we have to acknowledge and incorporate this inherent negativity of reality into the process. We have to turn our failures into opportunities for success. And if instead we just want to always win, we're never going to get anywhere, because that's not how reality works. And so we have to engage with the messy process of the alchemical, soupy, great work to try to find our way to our will. And if we try to skip the complexity of that, we're just going to stay stuck in narcissism. And instead, what we want to do is develop our psyche so that we have a complex and coherent sense of self. Anyway, so he talks about here, he says, the actual process of ideation becomes apodictic. What that means is ideation relates to the ideal, meaning in a Hegelian sense, the spirit with a capital S. And this is the whole process of what's called the dialectic, which is this alchemical tarrying with the negative. this alchemical process where you have to begin with the Negretto, where things break down, but then that creates an opportunity for new life and new creativity. And then apodictic just means a priori or self-evidently true. So what he means here is that the process of ideation, which is the way that we manifest the magical universe of our reality and then our true will within that reality, as a process that is produced by human activity, that we are the ones who are doing this. We're the gods who are casting the spell that creates the experience of reality around us, but it's unconscious. And so we have to make that process through a kind of therapy. We have to bring consciousness to that unconscious process. And that allows for the psyche to be integrated. And then when it becomes integrated, the totality or the wholeness of this process as a kind of dynamic, creative, wonderful thing becomes apodictic. It becomes self-evident because it's then programmed into the transcendental horizon, and we don't have to think about it anymore. It becomes part of our very sense of being. Stephen, if you could pick up where he says the trance of wonder arises naturally.
The trance of wonder arises naturally. It is the first movement of the mind. From the final phase of the oath of the master of the temple, I will interpret every phenomenon as particular dealing with God with my soul.
That means you're owning the whole of your magical universe as your productive activity. It's what you're doing and who you are. Keep going.
For immediately the understanding illuminates the darkness of knowledge. Every fact appears in its true guise miraculous.
Understanding with a capital U means neshama. It means bina. And so again, it's this precognitive wholeness that then is the source of the lux, of the illumination, as we tap into that, where the unconscious becomes conscious. Keep going.
It is so then, how marvelous that it should so be. In all trances of importance, and most especially in this, the postulant should have acquired the greatest possible knowledge and understanding of the universe, properly so called. His rational mind should have been trained thoroughly in intellectual apprehension. That is, he should be familiar with all science. This is evidently impossible on the face of it, but he should aspire the closest approximation to perfect adeptship in this manner. The method most possible is to make a detached study of some chosen branch of one science and a general study of epistemology. Then, by analogy, fortified by contemplation, a certain inner apprehension of the unity of nature may grow upon the mind, one which will not be unduly presumptuous and misleading.
Okay, let's pause there. Okay, so the ideal here is derived from the Renaissance art of memory, which you might remember we were talking about last week. And this is the idea that since the soul is a mirror of the world soul, so remember in Neoplatonic theology and then also in Renaissance magic, the idea is that the cosmos is in soul. So there's a kind of world soul or universal soul. And then in Thelema, this is taken up with Hadith being kind of the personal instantiation of soulness and then the totality is then Nuit. So then the interaction of these two gives rise to Horus as the symbol of the true will, or the stand-in for the manifestation of the knowledge and conversation of the holy guardian angel. One of my teachers, Phyllis Seckler, used to always say that the Rahor Kuit, the figure of Horus in the Book of the Law, is a stand-in for the holy guardian angel. If that's helpful in your interpretation of the text, that's great. I just want to throw that out there. So the ideal here is that if the soul is a mirror of nature, and nature being the divine in terms of its ensoulment as a totality, then the more the mind reflects the full complexity of the world, then the more efficacious its illumination will be. So in other words, the bigger you are in terms of your knowledge, your comprehension of reality, the more efficacious your true will be, because you'll have more information to be able to provide for that, the oriented, because remember, the true will, as I'm defining it here, is the optimization of your ultimate potential for being and the symbolization of that. So the bigger your world picture is, the more complete your understanding of your true will is able to be. And again, this is an ideal, so it can't be totally realized, but that's okay. It's like we do what we can. Now, it's important here that Crowley does not consider this comprehension as separate from the natural sciences. So all kinds of information is going to be part of our comprehension of the world. And the natural sciences are part of that, not the whole of, but part of that conversation. And so what Crowley is trying to do is push back against old eon forms of mysticism that oppose religion to science. And Crowley is saying is that that's a false path, that mysticism and spirituality and magic shouldn't be divorced from science. Rather, they should be forms of science. And this is why he defines magic as the science and art of causing change and conformity with will. So there's no contradiction here. And in this sense, Crowley is aligned with what we might call the humanist ideal in modern philosophy, and not so aligned with the anti-intellectual tendency in modern thought, which is exemplified by the quest for probably the best example of the kind of anti-intellectual tendency in modern theology and philosophy is represented by exoteric Protestantism and their obsession with faith in opposition to knowledge. So Martin Luther, for example, doesn't like humanism, although he is himself a humanist. And so for him, faith is opposed to scientific knowledge. It occurs in a different domain, and they're not compatible with each other. And in this, he is kind of furthering a scholastic distinction between philosophy and theology that Thomas Aquinas kind of popularized, but he's taking it more to the extreme. Because, of course, Aquinas doesn't have any problem with science. He just thinks it should be in its own kind of domain and that it addresses certain questions that aren't the questions of theology and vice versa. But for Luther and the Puritans and Calvinists who follow him, faith is more actively opposed to knowledge. And in fact, knowledge is then winds up being kind of denigrated. And so that's where you get in, fundamentalist Christianity, this negativity towards science, and that winds up with false views of the world like creationism and stuff like that. So Crowley is trying to push back against that tendency. Crowley was himself a Darwinist. He affirmed natural selection as the a fact about nature, and so he's not interested in forms of spiritual, or he's critical, I should say, of forms of spirituality that would oppose the findings of natural science, which he thinks have their place in their role in the total world picture that we need to have to be able to understand the world. And then understanding the world, you can then understand your place in the world in terms of your true will. Hence the importance of epistemology. He says you should make a detached study of some chosen branch of one science and a general study of epistemology. Okay, why is epistemology the most important? Epistemology is the branch of philosophy that's concerned with how we know things. So again, it's a kind of, we're not just, what's important is that we're not just knowing about the world, but we're understanding how it is that we know about the world. And the reason Crowley is emphasizing this is that this is one way to get to the understanding of realizing that we have this function called neshama, or the imaginary, or the transcendental horizon, or the semiotic structuring of the unconscious, or whatever theoretical, all these things are cognating, are kind of can be conflated together into kind of a unified theory of the self, although they emerge from different philosophical traditions in modernity. And so epistemology is crucial because it's a kind of overarching science or approach to then understanding how the things that you learn in science can be coordinated with each other. So that's it, and it gets at this kind of horizontal understanding of being, because epistemology begins in skepticism. It begins with the question, how do we know things? We know that we do know things, but then the question is, how is that possible? And that leads to a deeper then understanding that we can only understand things if we already have a certain structuring in our mind that permits us to then have an experience of the world. And then the question is then, to try to understand that structuring, and that becomes able to be thematized as a project in philosophy and also in psychology. Let's continue and pick up where it says, but our work demands. Henry, if you could pick up there.
But our work demands more than this. The neshama, or intuitive mind, must also be furnished with knowledge and understanding of those planes of nature which are inaccessible to the untrained sense. That is, he must pursue our methods of vision with indefatigable ardor.
Okay, Crowley makes a very important point here that might slip by, so we need to emphasize it. He says, the neshama, or intuitive mind, must also be furnished with knowledge and understanding. In other words, the imaginary has to also be reprogrammed to liberate it from the programming that it's inherited from the old eon. So what this means is that if the transcendental horizontal structuring of our mind is semiotically structured, if, as Lacan says, the unconscious is structured as a language, then what this means is that we receive that structuring from our primary Oedipal socialization as children, which means we're imprinted with all kinds of potentially ambiguous, patriarchal, and other problematically ideological patternings from the outside society that kind of unconsciously accrue in our mind. And we have to analyze and sort of reprogram ourselves to deal with those aspects of our unconscious. So in other words, the imaginary itself, neshama itself, has to be, as it were, re-educated. And this aligns with a kind of important point that Freud makes, which is that so he talks about how the superego, or the censor, is a kind of a sense that we have that tells us whether or not our thoughts are correct or not. It's kind of internal, and it can have a moral aspect, but it can also just be confused. And Freud's point is that the superego is not inherently good. In fact, it's infused with all kinds of confusions that we derive from primary socialization. And so part of the process of therapy is to strengthen the ego, the sense of self-identity, so that it doesn't just uncritically accept its unconscious impulses from the superego in terms of how it's supposed to evaluate its experience. So again, the neshama itself also has to be re-educated. Okay, let's pick up again. Stephen, if you could start again at now in all of this, the true unitive, etc.
Now in all of this, the true unintuitive and transcendental
The
science
true unitive and transcendental.
is that of mathematics for the Ruach, and its crown, the Holy Kabbalah, for the Neshama.
Okay, do you notice he uses the word transcendental? That's the term from the transcendental horizon. It's a Kantian term, and he's not referring to transcendental in the sense of being in another world, but in transcendental in the sense that you understand what the conditions of the possibility are for the manifestation of this world from within the perspective of this world. And that's what it means to have a sort of transcendental science. Immanuel Kant uses this phrase to describe his philosophy. Keep going.
There is a definite critical stage comparable to that familiar to the adepts of Asana and Dharana, after which terms of the equation, like the latter terms of the binomial expansion, repeat themselves, though after another manner, so that the meditation becomes progressively easier. The postulant, so to speak, finds himself at home. The added knowledge is no longer a burden to the mind. He is able to throw off the gross facts which present themselves as complications and to apprehend their essence and simplicity. He has in fact succeeded in developing a higher functioning of the mind. The process is similar to that which occurs in ordinary study of science, when one, by grasping the nature of the general law underlying the diversity of experience, is able to not only assimilate new facts with ease, but to predict new facts wholly unknown. One may instance the discovery of Neptune from the mathematical consideration without optical research, and the description of unknown elements of the contemplation of the periodic law. Let it be known that each such step in meditation is itself a motive energy capable of inducing the trance. And this trance, like all others, grows in sublimity and splendor with the quantity and quality of the material which is furnished by the mind of the adept.
Okay.
Furnished by the mind of the adept.
So he talks about the terms of a binomial expansion. That's a mathematical expression where you have bracketed two terms and then it's raised to some power. So it would be like something like, a plus b, and then in parentheses, square or to the third power or something like that. And there's a technique of what's called binomial expansion where you can write out this expression in a kind of repeating form. It's called Pascal's triangle, but you don't have to know what that is. You can look it up, if you want to. But certain terms will repeat in that when you expand the expression that way. And what Crowley means by that is because he's referring to what he calls the terms of the equation with a capital E. Okay, this is another point where Crowley is talking about something that he assumes that you know what he means, but doesn't tell you what he means because he just assumes you already know. This equation with a capital E is the 0 equals 2 equation. These are the two terms that as you're practicing magic, re-express themselves again and again at different levels of your experience. And these two terms are either nuit for the 0 and hadit for the 2, so the interaction of the two, and it's the Kabbalistic 0 as the absolute, and then 2 is the experience of the life world. The point being that these two are actually equivalent. They're not separate realities. They're just different ways of looking at the same phenomenon. And so that dynamic equilibrium between these two terms, which are like flip sides of the same coin, like sorrow and wonder, subject, object, world, experiencer of world, and so forth, self, society, any kind of pair of opposites that you would then dialectically mediate with each other. These two terms of the equation, the 0 and the 2, and their equivalents will reoccur at all the different levels of magical experience. And so once you learn the formula and how to apply it, the complexity you encounter is manageable because you can always apply the same formula. Okay, so then let us, he talks about a higher function of the mind and that you're supposed to in magic be developing a higher function of the mind. Okay, this relates to a distinction in Freudian psychoanalysis between two different psychological functions, two different instincts, which are the life instincts and the death instincts, or the libido and the drive. And so the idea is that the psyche is structured affectively. All of our affect meaning that the aboutness of our experience has an emotive libidinal quality to it. And all of our intuitions are kind of bound up with felt emotional affectivity. We never have a neutral experience, or if we experience that neutrality is self-contrast with other affective on a scale of affectivity. And this is what Freud calls psychic energy, which is also what he calls the libidinal dynamic of the psyche. You could say that the libido is basically the energy that constitutes the structure of the psyche. But this dynamic seeks what Freud calls the pleasure principle, meaning that it seeks a kind of equilibrium that is at the lowest level because it's trying to just sustain a kind of equilibrium with itself. And for the psyche to develop, that equilibrium needs to be disrupted. And it's disrupted by what Freud calls the drive, which he identifies with what he calls knowledge, which is also what Crowley is calling knowledge with a capital K, which is also going to lead to or develop into what he calls understanding, which is the neshamic, or the understanding or comprehension of the true will. Okay, this is a kind of complicated concept of the Freudian drive, and we're going to be developing this kind of in stages, like modules, as we proceed through the class. So it's okay if this isn't completely comprehensible immediately. Again, I just want to lay the pieces out. So we'll talk more about the drive in the next chapter, which I want to get to. So let's first finish this chapter. So he says, those therefore who affect to despise profane science. Stephen, I think you're next. Could you pick up there and then read to the end of the chapter?
Sorry, I lost my place.
It should be where it says, those therefore who affect to despise.
Those, therefore, who affect to despise profane science are themselves despicable. It is their own incapacity for true thought of any serious kind, their vanity and pertness, nay, more also. Their own subconscious sense of their own shame and idleness that induces them to build these flimsy fortifications of pretentious ignorance. There is nothing in the universe which is not of supreme significance, nothing which may be not used as the very keystone of the rainbow arc of the trance of wonder. It is necessary to add but one brief word to this elementary essay. This trance is of its nature not only passive and intuitive. Its occurrence floods the mind with creative power, it fills the adept with power, and excites him the will to work. It exalts him to his absolutic world in his essence, and in his manifestation to the Briatic. It is very special sense, therefore, it may be said that the postulant is most intimately united with the Supreme Lord God Most High, the true and living creator of all things, whensoever he attains to enter this most majestic pylon of the trance of wonder.
Okay, and the Supreme Lord God Most High is our own innermost being, not a external divinity in another world. And Briatic refers to Bina or Neshama, and the manifestation of that, meaning the manifestation of the true will. And so the point here is that when he says that it's not merely passive and intuitive, what he's saying here is, again, this links to Freud's concept of the drive, because the drive is the developmental process of the psyche, which structures in a complex way the libidinal dynamic of the psyche. So if the libido seeks the pleasure principle, which is to remain in a state of kind of basic narcissistic equilibrium, that the drive is the structuring of that affectivity in a more complex way, and the dynamic towards that structuring that leads towards a more complex knowing of the self and the development of the subjectivity and the psyche. Now, this structuring is of the libido. So it's not a separate process, but it's a kind of second order structuring of the libidinal dynamic that isn't just reducible to the mere affectivity itself. In other words, affectivity takes on a kind of second order organized purposiveness. And it's precisely that purposiveness that connects to the dynamic of the true will. Again, we'll have more to say about this as we go. We don't have much time left, so I'm going to summarize this chapter on Beatitude rather than having us read all of it. So he talks a bit about something related to the vision of Beatitude related to Kether. We're just going to sort of skip that. He says, let us occupy ourselves with the lower form of this vision, so-called, pertaining to Tiferet. So in other words, this is the natural grace of the recipient of knowledge and conversation. And it implies, he says, a certain innocence, a certain defect of understanding, which is not possible to master the temple. In other words, it's a way to kind of insulate yourself from the vision of sorrow through, again, a kind of attainment of the pleasure principle. So basically what he's talking about is that Tiferet is at the center of the tree. So when you're practicing mysticism, you can reach a point where you have a kind of spontaneous sense of peace and balance and equilibrium of wellness and goodness that can come over you. And you can kind of be satiated by that. And the tendency in mysticism is to try to remain in this state because it's felt to be a state of beatitude, meaning of grace that's being received from the divine, such that your soul is at peace. And Crowley's point is that if you become too attached to this experience, that you'll block yourself from further development. Because again, this is a seeking of a kind of lower level energy state, and you want to achieve a kind of higher level energy state. And so you want to break out of the pleasure principle and instead seek after this developmental principle of the psyche. And so that's why he says only in the center of the tree of life In the self-poised security of the solar axis, can we expect to find the steady indifference to event, which is the basis of this trance? And it's psychologically a state, meaning it's not just a kind of state of being. It's more immediately psychological and emotional, and therefore more limited in that sense. It's not very deep, in other words, is what Crowley's saying. And the trance can be continued for weeks or months, and it arises not from action, but rather from a subtle suspension of action. And that's why it's pietistic, and therefore Crowley is kind of suspicious of it. It has its role and its place, but it also has to be overcome and transcended. The conflict of events has ended happily in a state of serenely perfect balance, equilibrium, and energy continues to manifest, but without significance. We can compare the condition with the return to health of a fever-stricken man, also maybe with the addict of opium. And like opium, it kind of causes you to withdraw, you become passive, and you withdraw into meditation, and you just want to remain in this state. And that's the mistake. And there he says, the state is in many respects closely akin to that sought by the smoker of opium, but is natural and requires no artificial regulation. It will appear from the foregoing that nothing could be more absurd than to attempt to give instructions for the attainment of this state. It just sort of overcomes you at certain points in your magical career. It's not deleterious. It should be accepted when it occurs with calm indifference, enjoyed to the full, and quitted without regret. Its occurrence is in any case clear evidence that the adept has reached a definite and rather exalted state of being. It proves the possibility of perfect repose in the midst of activity, and thus indicates the solution of the ultimate problem of philosophy. It should encourage the adept in aspiration, serve him as refreshment and nourishment. Let therefore the postulant in the Rosy Cross pursue his path in solemn strength, aware that at the proper moment he may receive, unasking, the reward and enjoy the vivifying flood of dulcet life, which has been called by the adepts the beatific vision. So he's not saying it's bad, just that it's a little bit limited. And so, and the point here is that equanimity, which we could describe this trance in terms of, is a position of balance of forces, again, represented by Tiferet on the tree. It's neither to be sought nor rejected, but simply enjoyed for what it is. Because as a state of being, equanimity is only one possible state among many for manifesting the true will. And ultimately, the true will is an activity. And this is why equanimity can interfere with it, because equanimity, if it's just focused on for its own sake, leads to passivity, which, while not bad, it can only be part of the larger story. And again, the true will is about the whole. It's about the totality, not just a part of the picture. So Thelema rejects quietism, or rather sees it as a means to an end rather than an end in itself. And in that sense, it's different from other forms of mysticism, which seek equanimity for its own sake, and maybe even identify that with enlightenment. More sophisticated forms of mysticism, particularly in Buddhism, are, of course, critical of that approach. And remember, the whole point here is that the growth and development of the psyche requires engagement with the shadow. It requires engagement with the necessarily negative aspect of existence and of experience, which is bound up with the absolute being, the Kabbalistic zero. And so the equanimity of the libidinal dynamic in the psyche, which may be invoked at certain moments in magical practice, must ultimately be disturbed by the reawakening of the magical drive of the true will. So that's the point of this chapter, which we've gone a little bit quickly through, but it's I think that's the basic point of this chapter. We've got about 5 minutes more, so I want to open to questions and discussion. Stephen, Henry, do you have any questions or comments, or want to ask me anything about what we've just gone through?
Sure. So when we talk about reaching, Adeptus Minor and having that, holy guardian angel, knowledge and conversation. And then we talk about becoming a babe of the abyss, basically essentially like giving up that connection to be like reborn in the city of pyramids, to use that phrasing. Is that basically what we're talking about here? That like this idea of knowledge and conversation is this central equilibrium of peace in that, but like true adepthood requires giving that up.
It requires giving it up, but only in a certain sense, because you can return to it too. It's just that you're moving from focusing on one particular state of attainment, and you're looking in terms of how that relates to then the bigger picture. So you're not just resting in that, you're seeing how does this relate to my larger trajectory? So that, I meditate and I feel good. Okay, I just want to meditate all the time. Okay, but I need to do something with this understanding or knowledge. Who am I, and what am I supposed to be doing? Because it's probably not just sitting around like a sack of vegetables. This is called in Zen, the stink of enlightenment, that you have these experiences of deep peace and abiding calm, and you try to remain in that, and you can't, the point is that you're not going to be able to do that. But you can take the wisdom that you've gained from that and apply it to the bigger picture. So in the case of knowledge and conversation, your angel is delivering your true will to you and communicating that to you, but then you have to do that true will. And if you just rest in the communion with the angel, it becomes too passive and you're not doing that. As for the distinction with the level of the understanding of at neshama, the idea of becoming a babe of the abyss is that if knowledge and conversation involves you being a self that then comes into communication with a higher self, there's still a kind of dualism implied in that. And so at the level of the supernals, that dualism would in some sense be overcome. So you wouldn't just abandon or not experience the angel anymore. You would discover that in terms of the totality of your psyche, you are the angel. And so there's ultimately no duality between you and the angel. But that means that you're always in knowledge and conversation, and you don't have to have it as a separate, distinct experience from your regular train of, experiences. But for that to be meaningful, you can't just say that rationally, like I just did. That's all well and good, Nathan, that we just said that, but we have to understand that with a capital U. It can't just be something I'm thinking at the level of the Ruach. It has to inform my whole being as a state of being, which has become so deeply ingrained into one's unconscious that it becomes spontaneously expressed. And so you don't have to even thematize it. You just act from that understanding. And that's the position of the master of the temple, because they're identified with neshama. And so all of these stages where you're building up to that understanding now become like integrated parts of a total experience, where the individual parts no longer have to be like staged out in separation. They can now form a kind of gestalt. Or that would be my understanding anyway.
Great.
Again, this is all a conversation. And so again, I'm not trying to make any kind of dogmatic point or another. I'm just trying to phenomenologically try to use this method to try to unpack these ideas and try to construct a kind of theory that might be magically useful. I hope that maybe answered your
thanks.
questions.
I think it definitely did, because I think, that was
we're going to be, again, as we proceed with this class, we're going to return to all of these themes and ideas multiple times from different angles. And so we'll have a chance to really kind of unpack these ideas from different angles. Cool. Henry, before we go, do you have anything you want to say or add or ask?
I guess right at the end, when you were talking about Beatitude, I felt like you were contrasting true will as an activity, but it seems like it's, in some degree, it's an activity that requires this engagement with the negative.
Yes,
and you
it has to include that as part of the picture.
At that point, you said something about the catalytic zero.
Yes.
And I didn't quite understand which part of what I just said related back to the catalytic zero. Was it the experience of the negative, or is it the lack of activity?
It does in the first sense, which is that the fundamental negative quality of reality the fact that all compound aggregates are subject to decay and that there's no such thing as an abiding self or is a function of the Kabbalistic zero being the ultimate philosophical principle in Thelemic philosophy. In a similar way to Anatman being the ultimate philosophical principle in Buddhism, or shunyata, or voidness. And again, we're going to talk more about that as we go.
Okay.
This is why you can't get away from the negative, why you can't abide in beatitude, because at a certain point, the beatitude will end, because it's a compound aggregate and all compound aggregates are subject to decay. You can't stay in it forever. So you need to seek something more. You need to seek the whole, not just the part. Again, we're out of time, but we'll have more to say about this as we proceed. I hope that just covered it kind of just initially.
That helped tie it together a little more.
Okay, the Kabbalistic zero is a complex philosophical concept, and so there's we're going to have to sort of build up our understanding of it as we proceed through the course. Sort of like Heidegger's being with the capital B. It seems like the most simplest thing that you could say, but it turns out to be this really complicated philosophical concept that requires a lot of explication to get clear about. And the Kabbalistic zero is the same way. So anyway, we're out of time. Thanks everybody for joining us, and we will be continuing this next week and try to go a little bit deeper. Okay, thanks for joining me.
Great. Thank you very much. Bye,
Okay,
Nathan.
great. Love is the law, love under will.
93.